together virtually today. For thousands of years, the land has been the home of Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized tribes. Those are the Cachel-Dihi band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian community, the Quetzal-Dihi Wintun Nation, and the Yocha-Dihi Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of the land over many centuries, and it's been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We're honored and grateful to recognize today their traditional lands. We also recognize that at this moment, Palestinians are experiencing active occupation and displacement from their homelands, and that land is being occupied and taken from many different parts of the world. Part of this is that the UC has been a supporter and investor of the 30-meter telescope at Mauna Kea. And that is land that holds deep meaning and significance to our native Hawaiians. We encourage you to be part of this mobilization to divest as well. We also hope that you take the time to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on this land and to seek to understand your place within that history. So land acknowledgements don't necessarily exist in a past tense, and they're not historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness around our present participation. And we encourage you to educate yourself about the original and current caretakers of the land, water, and air from where you're joining us from today. We'll be sharing a web link in the chat where you can do so. Omar, would you like to start us off with our faculty introductions, please?
Yeah, I want to thank our faculty for making time for today's panel and for doing this on such short notice and coming together. We're really honored to have our distinguished guests here today. So I'll start by introducing Esmat Elhalaby, who is a historian of the transnational Middle East and South, Middle East and South Asia. Esmat is currently a University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of California, Davis, and an incoming assistant professor at the University of Toronto. We also have Dr. Sunaina Myra, who is a professor of Asian American Studies and affiliated with the Middle East South Asia Studies program and the Cultural Studies graduate group. Her research and teaching focuses on Asian, Arab, and Muslim American youth culture, migrant rights, and refugee organizing, and transnational movements challenging militarization, imperialism, and settler colonialism. Dr. Myra published a book on ethnographic research on Palestine and is a Mellon ACLS Scholars and Society Fellow for 2019-2020. Her new transnational research focuses on Arab refugees and immigrants in the Bay Area and in Athens, Greece. And Dr. Myra is also at UC Davis.
We also have Lisa Rofel with us, who is a Professor Emerita at University of California, Santa Cruz. She's a national board member of Jewish Voice for Peace and was for many years co-coordinator of California Scholars for Academic Freedom and remains on the executive committee. She has published numerous books and articles on China's transition from socialism to capitalism with a focus on gender, sexuality, and changing forms of inequality. Most recently, she's working on a collective project on China and the Global South. David Lloyd is a distinguished professor of English at the University of California, Riverside, and works primarily on post-colonial and cultural theory, critical race theory, and on Irish culture. He's also published numerous articles on Palestine and Israel, including settler colonialism and the state of exception, the example of Israel and Palestine.
So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our questions for today and have our panel discuss. So as a reminder, we're going to go through some questions with our panel, and then we will also hopefully have some time to do some Q&A. So please feel free to use the Q&A feature or message in the chat your question, and we'll do our best to get to it towards the end of the program. So the first question I want to start with is just asking that, you know, it's evident within academic spaces that there's often a lot of mass censorship when it comes to the Palestinian struggle. Can you share how you've seen the censorship take form and how you navigate this?
Yes, I think I'll start by saying a couple of things about that. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Ohlone land in Oakland. I want to thank my wonderful colleagues from the various Swana and Manasa centers. I think having these centers and campuses in of itself is really a sign of the growing student movement in support of justice in the Middle East and Palestine. So I wanted to actually sort of answer the question from a different angle by talking about the ways in which this repression is in response to the growth of the Palestinian rights movement, especially on campuses. And the BDS movement is actually clearly one of the most important global justice movements in the university today. So I want to very briefly highlight, I'm just going to do a screen share, the 3 principles of the BDS movement, because I would like us to begin from a point of affirming positively the principles for which the Palestinian justice movement stands, and then look at what it means to actually be opposed to these principles. So the call for BDS actually suggests that we should boycott and divest from Israel until it complies with international human rights law by 1, ending the occupation and colonization of Arab Palestinian lands and dismantling the apartheid wall, 2, recognizing the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel to racial equality, and 3, respecting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return as upheld by international law. So therefore, those who oppose the BDS and Palestinian justice movement oppose ending colonialism, racial justice and racial equality, and the rights of refugees. So it's very important for us to stay steadfast and strong in affirming these principles. And the ways in which I have seen the response or the backlash take form is through diverting from these rights-based frameworks and progressive leftist justice frameworks. So in other words, rather than having a political counter-argument or a moral counter-argument, what anti-Palestinian forces do is divert to talking about allegations and fallacious accusations of anti-Semitism, or actually distorting the narrative, right, and shifting focus to other issues. So I think it's important to remember in our response that BDS is a constitutionally protected right to freedom of political expression, that the principles of BDS are grounded in racial justice and international human rights. And what is really the problem, the way I've seen, the impact of the repression, is that it amplifies self-censorship. So my concern as a UC faculty member is the self-censorship, the anxiety that I see amongst my students and activists on campus. And this is the desired end goal of Zionist backlash, is to silence and suppress the movement. Therefore, I think it's very important that we organize collectively and create structures of support and solidarity. I'm seeing more support in the academy than I ever have before. It's at the expense, certainly, of more Palestinian lives every time Israel goes to war and commits massacres. However, I think there's an opening here, and I'm very heartened by it. We also have resources. I just want to mention there's Palestine Legal and other organizations that are actually actively defending students and academics who are under attack. And so I really would suggest people turn to those resources as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunaina, for that. I think it's essential that we foreground what it is that we support and what's being brought into question by the people who have tried to censor our speech. I will say, however, that certainly with BDS's successes and strengths, there has been a remarkable amount of backlash. But the backlash in the United States to Palestinian political activity and support for Palestine in general has been there from the very beginning. I mean, in 1947, the Arab Office, which was a group of Arabs in the US who were working sort of with the support of the Arab League to make the case for Palestinians in the US, their office was raided by the FBI in 47 on the grounds that they were anti-Semitic, right? So it starts from the very beginning. I think that's important to remember. Then you can move into Nixon's administration and Operation Boulder and the kinds of anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian censorship, surveillance, monitoring that took place then. Of course, we all know that, and I think that's essential to remember. But I think to get to some of the specific areas where I've seen this censorship, I could talk about three in particular that I think are important to remember. And I think self-censorship is a key component of all this stuff, especially when we're talking about the university and we're talking about public support for Palestine, which I think is different from all the sorts of political activity that takes place outside of the public sphere, outside of classrooms and journals and so on. So the first thing I think would be in our research, and I think till this day, you'd be hard pressed to find Palestinian or Arab graduate students or faculty members who do not feel certain pressure not to say or not to work on specific topics. And this is despite the fact that increasingly, with the evidence of so many centers for Palestine studies and so many book series in support of Palestine, that Palestine is certainly, without any doubt, a very legitimate area of academic research. Whether we should be studying Palestine as its independent example in the first place is its own question, but that's another thing. I think it's essential that we, as we do our research and train students to research, we recognize that fact, that there is a idea that if you are, especially if you are Arab or Palestinian, that kind of work can be seen as detrimental to your career. The second place is in journals and especially magazines and newspapers, where you often have editors with very little understanding or experience of the question of Palestine and Israeli colonization of Palestine, who attempt to get you to say certain things in certain kinds of way and to lessen the strength of your language. And I think it's important to remember that the facts are on our side when it comes to talking about colonialism in Palestine. And you can always, if you choose to, use the language of the United Nations, of international law, of all the sorts of things that are generally seen in the media as legitimate sources of evidence. If they're uninterested, now one thing that comes up in this case is they're always going to ask you to talk about your family instead. And if you go look at the New York Times for the last couple of weeks and look at the kinds of things that have been published about Palestine by Palestinians, every single op-ed in these big newspapers is going to inevitably involve the Palestinian or Arab op-ed writer talking about their family. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course, but if you're going to look at every op-ed that's written by Bret Stephens or whoever sort of like peddler of lies, there's no recourse, certainly no recourse to facts, but there isn't even recourse to this family. So I think we should be careful not to constantly be forced to only make our case through this kind of process of humanization through family. And lastly, I think when it comes to public events and asking questions, I think certainly a lot of activists on campus have had the experience of the police or campus security pulling them out of events for simply asking questions. And that, of course, can be very intimidating, and there's no sort of way around it. I think you have to keep asking the questions. So those are the sort of three areas I thought I'd mention.
And Lisa, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add, or we can go to the next question.
No, let's just go to the next question, please.
Sure.
All right, so our next question speaks a little bit about Canary Mission. So Canary Mission has been used as a tactic to coerce fear among academic scholars, students, and activists, and doxing continues to remain a threat to Palestinian organizers. Do any of you have any strategies as to how to navigate this threat? And Sunaina, David, we can start off with you.
Yeah, I'll be happy to speak to that as a proud member of the Canary Mission community. I've been up there for quite a while. It's actually, I find, a strange mixture of terrorism and comedy, the comedy part being that it actually provides a very good archive of one's statements that sometimes one doesn't archive oneself. So if you want to find out what I have said in public events about Israel's apartheid regime and the colonial nature of Zionism as a political philosophy, go to Canary Mission and you can actually download some video clips and things like that. The terror side is exactly that. This is one of the many ways in which supporters of Zionism exert terror in place of argument. It was not apparent when the BDS movement first started gathering steam in the United States, which I would date back to Operation Cast Lead, Israel's notoriously brutal assault on Gaza, just as President Obama was being inaugurated. At that point, we found that Zionists were actually eager to debate until they discovered that the facts were against them. And at that point, to continue the answer to the previous question in a way, they began increasingly to resort to a combination of tactics designed to terrorize people out of speaking up for Palestine. Those have included lawfare, about which I know Sunaina Mara can say much more. I would also include in that doxing strategies like Canary Mission, and also just the spate of letters and protests that get written by advocates of all these pressure groups like AMCA, to which Lisa Rofel can speak since it's based at UCSF, that are highly funded but really quite small organizations, as is Canary Mission, and which are designed really to make people frightened. In some ways, I'd compare it to the price tag terrorist organization in Israel at the moment, which tags Arab properties, Palestinian properties in Israel and beyond for assault, vandalism, and so forth, and which does so under the pretext that they are exerting a cost on people who oppose the apartheid regime in Israel. In effect, those extreme right-wing organizations are very like what Canary Mission tries to do by putting up photos and exaggerating or inventing notions of the anti-Semitism or whatever of the people that they're posting up there. I think the response to it is to recognize that the more we propagate the message of BDS, the more we explain what we are saying about Israel as a settler colonial apartheid regime publicly, clearly, and especially factually, the more our public comes to recognize that what we are saying is reasonable, that it is in line with a long tradition of human rights activism, civil rights activism in this country, going back to the civil rights movement itself and before that, and of course, gaining inspiration from the movement for divestment from apartheid in South Africa. One can already begin to see the public mood and the public opinion changing with the election of people into Congress who actually support sanctioning Israel in some form or other, from Bernie Sanders to AOC to Ilhan Omar to Rashida Tlaib, all are actually products of the organizing that we have been done. On the contrary, if you back off from your statements, if you back off from your engagement and your activism and your dissemination of information on this, it encourages them. I would guess that Canary Mission has very little effect on people's careers anymore. It may have done for a brief period, but the fact that BDS has now become a parlance that is circulating in public quite openly and quite frankly, means that, who is really going to sanction you that you would want to work for actually being an advocate for it. So I would say, as with all of these things, the more you engage and the more you involve yourself in movement, the less fear you will have. And that's actually a fundamental principle that maybe we'll come back to when we discuss what gives us hope.
Sunaina, would you like to add on, or shall we go on to our next question?
Well, I can add on if there's time. Actually, the one thing that I did want to share, kind of building on what my colleague David Lloyd has just said, I'm going to do a screen share again for a second. I want to share the ways in which activists have actually been collectively providing solidarity to those who have this badge of honor of being on Canary Mission by creating this resource called Against Canary Mission. And I want to acknowledge this was done through the labor of activists in the US Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, USACB, which David and I both organize with. And I want to note that what activists have been trying to do is to flip this narrative, to actually claim support for Palestinian justice as something for which we should all be proud and from which we should all stand together collectively rather than having to deny it. And so I just want to second what David said, that what I actually tell students who are anxious, if they're not Palestinian, because I do think there is a difference in people's sort of expectations of the consequences of blacklisting if they are Palestinian. But I think for those who are not, for allies like myself, I think that the best defense is to be public, because then there is a record, as David just said, of what one's principles are and why we're being taken to task. And Canary Mission could fade, there could be another one. As Esmat said, this has been going on for a long time, but I do want to say two quick things. One is that after having noted the impact on students in the UCs, I do think it's important to report doxing, to document backlash, to share it with student affairs staff and administrators. I think it's very important to create this counter archive so that there is actually a record of what students are experiencing. I also do think that one has to be tactically smart. So, my emphasis is always that, we should not remain solely on the defensive. It's very important when we're countering this backlash to be always advancing our movement. And so we always need to have a kind of positive approach, right? Which is why I think the Against Canary Mission project is very important. Now, that said, I do want to acknowledge, as Esmat said, and I think Lisa has some examples of this, that actually blacklists do sometimes have an impact, on people. And I think for Palestinian students and Palestinian Americans who want to be traveling to Palestine, there is a great deal of justifiable fear that they may be denied entry because of what they're posting on social media. So I want to acknowledge this kind of uneven effect that it has. It amplifies the very conditions of oppression, restrictions on mobility, restrictions on the right to education that Palestinians experience in Palestine. But then the best thing we should do is to expose that constantly, to show that this is actually a war that is being fought here as well, and that it's being done through covert and underhanded ways. The reason why these forces want to remain anonymous is because it's no longer respectable to be anti-Palestinian. And I think we're at this turning point that I think is very critical.
Thank you. And I think you all have highlighted some of the ways that folks can become active and support the Palestinian struggle. So I would ask for the panel, what are some effective ways you've seen people support Palestinians, whether that be on UC campuses or as faculty or staff? What are some effective ways or strategies that you've seen or been part of?
I guess I'll go first. I'll start with campus activism. Students for Justice in Palestine have been just terrific. And it's very important to support them in whatever capacity you're in. On my campus, which is UC Santa Cruz, we used to have the problem that every year the Zionists on our campus would make up lies about what Students for Justice in Palestine did on Israel Apartheid Week. And then the students would, and the chancellor, of course, being a coward, would immediately condemn them. And then, of course, a little investigation would take place and he would realize that he had been wrong and would call them in quietly to his office to apologize, but never make a public statement. And I finally got really sick of this dynamic. And so one year, I can't remember how many years ago, I organized a faculty observation group. And we showed up at all Students for Justice in Palestine actions, and we did not participate in the action. We stood there and observed. And as a result, the Zionists knew that they couldn't lie anymore. So that lying about SJP completely disappeared after the first year we started standing there observing, making ourselves very, very obvious. The first time we did it, the Zionists had called in the police, and the police came running there and recording the activity. And I went up and said, we have this observation group. I just want to let you know. So then, supportive of SJP. And then he said, but all these students called. I said, no, one student called, and I pointed him out, and he called all his friends who are not even here to call you and tell you they were being harassed, but they're not even here. That kind of bullshit ended after that year. So I think that kind of activity on campus is very important. I also think whenever possible, it's important to get your student, as was successful yesterday at UC Davis, get the student, Senate or whatever they call it, student body to vote on supporting BDS. I also think that for faculty, it's important to get the faculty senates to vote on resolutions about this situation. And we have not succeeded in getting them to support BDS, but we certainly got them to succeed in condemning the Canary Mission. And all of these are very important activities on the campus. Going a little further afield, one very large project that many of us are involved in is ending US military aid to Israel. And I think if you students especially want to get active in that, that would be very easy to do. That's a really big struggle that David mentioned. We have more progressive people being elected to Congress, and they are very much behind this, very much behind this. And so you can call your representatives in Congress and tell them you want to end US military aid to Israel, and you can get involved in that activity. The other thing that's going on in California in particular that I encourage all of you to get involved in, we've been struggling over a revision to the ethnic studies curriculum in K through 12 in California. And again, the Zionists allied themselves with white supremacists to squash the critical ethnic studies curriculum that experts in the field had proposed. And the Zionists were mainly interested in getting rid of even the word Palestine anywhere in that curriculum. And the curriculum also was to include Arab American studies as part of Asian American studies. And the Zionists, again, succeeded in getting rid of that. And then, of course, white supremacists are not interested in any discussion of racism. So the Zionists allied themselves with white supremacists. And so now, and again, the Secretary of Education, another coward, caved in to that pressure. And so we are here with a the weaker than before ethnic studies curriculum. And the reason people are fighting over it is that it's going to be a requirement per California state legislature's recently passed law. It's going to be a requirement to take. So I think that's another struggle really, really worth getting involved in. It's just so important. As educators, we all believe that education makes a big difference. And you can contact the Arab Resource and Organizing Center if you want to get involved in that. Also, the Berkeley chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace is also involved in that. But it's really being led by the Arab Resource and Organizing Center. And I strongly encourage you to look at that. Sunaina and David have spoken to the BDS campaign, and that couldn't be more important. There are lots of ways to think about how to do that on your campuses. For the campuses that have study abroad programs in Israel, for example, you can demand that the university cut those ties with those Israeli universities so as not to support an apartheid regime. And also because Palestinian and Palestinian American students in the US are forbidden from taking advantage of those programs in Israel in particular. So that would be another activity to get, like action to get involved in to support Palestinian liberation. And so study abroad programs, the larger concerns about BDS, I think there was a link put into the chat box. I won't go into all the details, but there's of course the academic portion of the boycott, the cultural portion of the boycott, and the economic portion of the boycott. So you can find local companies, large local companies in your area that do business with Israel in the illegal settlements and pressure them to stop that business. And that has been very successful all over the country in pressuring businesses. Yes, and somebody wrote, Sunaina, end UC's complicity with Israel. Yeah, and so, I should mention one other, and that is the deadly exchange, stop the deadly exchange action. Police in the United States are regularly sent to Israel to be trained by Israeli police, regularly. And it's very, very important that we stop those exchanges. And that's an issue, I think, that moves beyond, it addresses all of the recent attention to the racism of the police, the campaign for cops off campus. And so I think that's something worth reaching out to everyone you have on your campus and beyond who is addressing the issue of racist police violence, that to really focus on ending that deadly exchange program, I think is also really critical. There's many, many more things you can do, but that's a start.
I think let's go ahead and move on to the next question so we have time for Q&A. So Afaf, if you want to go ahead and take the next one on.
Sure. So as we're talking, we're also thinking about folks who have Palestinian identities, right? And many of those folks are simultaneously grieving as well as educating those around themselves. And that work can be very labor intensive. So would you all have any words of advice to Palestinians who are feeling this way?
So I'll speak to this very briefly. I think there's no doubt that Palestinians in the United States face a particular kind of abuse in the media and so on. And there are certain things that can be said about Palestinians in Palestine and who they are and what they support that aren't necessarily said about other people. And this is, of course, a serious reflection of US support for Israel in Zionism. But I think an important thing to remember when doing this work is to understand, is not to get too caught up in any kind of narrow identitarian question and recognize that the kind of colonial and imperial arrangements that we are protesting in Palestine are familiar and they're resonant around the world, and they're not without precedent in the past either, right? And so we cannot cut ourselves off from the world because that, of course, is its own kind of censorship. To see the Palestinian question as simply one that is the concern of Palestinians or affects emotionally or psychologically or intellectually Palestinians is to cut the question off too early, right? And it's important to remember in doing this kind of work that in fact Palestinian anti-colonial nationalism was always very capacious in what it included. And at the first Palestinian Arab Congress in Jerusalem in 1911 or whenever it was, 1919, the anti-colonial activists there wanted to start a union with Syria, right? They thought, well, we want an end to foreign domination. We want to produce an Arab state between Palestine and the rest of the Levant, right? This is an important thing to remember, that since the very beginning, this anti-colonial project against a colonial one always drew from the world, and we can't forget that, I think.
So I think we'll go ahead and move to our final question to the panelists, and then we'll have some time to open up for Q&A and other questions that come up in the chat. So please feel free, for those of you that are in attendance, please feel free to type your questions in there. Some of them might be answered in the chat, and we'll try to paste those, what the original question is, but feel free to ask those so that we can have the faculty address them afterwards. So the last question we wanted to end on this segment of today is just, how do you continue to find hope, and what keeps you grounded in doing this work despite all of the challenges that come?
So I think there's perhaps plenty of reason to feel despair facing this issue, particularly when, certainly since 2009, when I got actively involved with US ACPI, there have been 4 explicit Israeli operations pounding Gaza in precisely the same way as we were responding to, as an act of grief and as an act of activism in, calling for the establishment of a US counterpart to the Palestinian call for academic and cultural boycott of Israel. That is a lot of life lost, brutally and unnecessarily, viciously, in what one can only think of as acts of terror and what Ilan Pappé, the Israeli historian, has called slow genocide. It's sometimes hard, just to regard that spectacle of murder and atrocity committed by the US's closest ally, as the administration keeps calling Israel, and not feel despair and hopelessness and sadness. On the other hand, we set up US ACPI at that point, as I remember, in the face of an extraordinary blockade on anything getting through that would be critical of what Israel was doing in that particular assault. All of the Congress voted with 4 courageous exceptions to support that action, even after 3 or 4 weeks of slaughter had gone on. At that point, we recognized, and this is something that's really important to think about so that one does not despair. At that point, we recognized that there was no movement through normal political processes like lobbying your congressperson and so forth. That what had to happen was the pushing of a civil society movement that would bypass those political channels, change public opinion, and then create the grassroots movement that you need to get anything radical done in this country. Working with that movement is, for me, always a source of hope, not only because of victories that we win from time to time, and there have been many of those victories in the past 10, 12 years, but also because even when you lose, you are doing the work successfully. Meaning that even when the huge and highly financed forces of Zionist lawfare, or the huge forces simply of the US military machine and its political representatives is opposed to you, the very fact that you are getting to speak in public, the very fact that the Zionists get all worked up about it and become a kind of megaphone for your ideas by trying to shout them down in public, means that you are actually reaching that public. And I think we have proved that again and again by the advances that BDS and simply the call for Palestinian rights have made in the public sphere. The second thing I want to say that gives me hope is that whereas Zionism forced onto a defensive by the facts about it, and I've been putting sources for those facts in the chat all along. The fact that it's apartheid regime, which it makes no particular bones about at home. They pass an Israel nationality law that insists that this is a Jewish state for a Jewish people. They pass all 65 discriminatory laws are on the books of adala.org that I put up there. All those things are not in fact hidden within Israel, but they have been using all kinds of euphemisms like the only democracy in the Middle East as ways to cover and to present this regime as a liberal regime rather than a settler colony to us here in the West. And in order to protect that, the only thing they can do is harden down, fasten down, and try to suppress speech. And that makes them rigid. On the other hand, the wonderful thing that I found working as an activist within US ACBI is that we have to keep reinventing ourselves. We have to keep reinventing our strategies. We have to keep rethinking. And it's not just rethinking tactics, it's also thinking about the goals of BDS, thinking about its relation to states, thinking about what rights means, thinking about whether there's a symmetry between justice and rights. All those things become part of how we're thinking. And it's incredibly enlivening. And I found this throughout my life, that in fact, being involved with various social struggles is actually very good for one's thinking. And since I assume we're talking mostly to students and faculty here, I think that's an important point to make. It gives one hope that it is still possible to imagine and to create alternatives. And that for me is just essential to living. So that's how I derive hope, even in the face of what looks like the most appalling and murderous resistance to what we have to say.
And I want to give anyone else who would like to share to answer this question of what brings you hope. And feel free to go ahead. Go ahead, Lisa.
I just wanted to say a few words, and then, yeah, we need to give over the rest of the time to Q&A. I think we're at a historical juncture, and I think it's really as a result of the huge amount of activism among Palestinian, Arab, and other organizations. David mentioned US ACBI. Arab Resource and Organizing Center, I keep repeating, is astoundingly fabulous and effective. I myself started out with International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, and IGEM put out a number of reports you can look up exposing a lot of the propaganda lies about what Jewish organizations were doing in Israel. Anyway, I feel like after, let's say, all these years, I would say even 30 years of that kind of organizing, when Israel bombed Gaza in 2014, my colleagues in anthropology didn't know anything at all. And they were not happy about the boycott resolution that we introduced. We only lost by about, 20 votes or something? Yeah, very close. But again, what David was saying is true. We did a huge amount of educational work, I would also like to thank Black Lives Matter activists, Native American activists, Asian American activists, because I think the Black Lives Matter movement has also made people pay attention to what Israel is doing to Palestinians in a way that people did not in the past. And I think those alliances among the various activist movements has meant that this time has been a completely different reaction than in 2014. The last time there was a huge bombing. And actually, people, I feel like, are more open to hearing the truth than they were back in 2014. So that's why I have hope.
All right, so we're going to transition over into our open Q&A session. Our first question that's come through is that there's often pressure from universities and educational spaces to have Israeli or Jewish students to sit alongside Palestinians and find common ground. How do you feel about these efforts and strategies? And anyone can take this question.
Can I address that? I think that's an excellent question because I think there's actually a coexistence industry in the United States that is actually imposed on universities and also on nonprofit organizations as the legitimate and respectable way to address Palestine. It's depoliticizing, it's deracinating, and it actually really neutralizes any kind of anti-colonial, anti-racist critique along the lines of what my colleagues have said. Now, I don't think there's a problem talking to Israelis or Jewish people or whatever. I do it all the time. You know, Lisa, Sarah Kirshner, other people in JVP are all comrades of mine. The point is to what end? And I think, you know, this is something I addressed in a book that I did called The 9/11 Generation, which focused in part on the Palestinian solidarity movement, in fact, in California and at campuses. And what I found is that there's a kind of framework of liberal interfaith dialogue and multicultural tolerance, which really, sort of depoliticizes and defangs an anti-colonial progressive critique of violence and colonization in Palestine. And so I think it is important for students to be able to have a Palestinian-centered discussion, to have Palestinians be able to speak about their own oppression in the terms they choose, and not through this institutional lens. And I expect we'll see more of this because universities are going to try to catch up to the student movement in its successes. And on that, note, one point I wanted to make earlier, which is that, I think for the first time ever, a US university academic press has issued an unapologetic statement of solidarity with the Palestinian liberation struggle. No yet. And this is actually the UC Press. So it's actually my publisher of a book on academic boycott. So University of California Press has actually stated in unequivocal, unapologetic terms that they are in solidarity with the Palestinian liberation struggle. So I think this is a real sign of the shift that's happening. And I think we need to not be afraid to go even further.
Esmat, do you want to go ahead and take that?
I'll just add one thing to what Sunaina said. In addition to this coexistence stuff that is totally insidious, I remember when I was, I don't know if it's still around, when I was in college, it was called Olive Tree Initiative or something terrible like that. But in addition to that, there's even the larger framework that is across the campuses and certainly in the course catalogs of understanding the colonization of Palestine as a conflict, right? In conflict studies and peace and conflict studies, and framing what's going on in Palestine in these terms. And of course, it's an effort to make comparisons that do not reflect the structural reality of colonialism in Palestine. And it's tied to a multi-billion-dollar industry at universities in the United States that also emerges from the Oslo framework. So I think it's important to always recognize that this stuff is totally tied into the kinds of legalistic discourse and rhetoric about peace that has been around for now some 30 years. That is starting to change, as Sunaina rightly mentioned, this UC Press statement, and so many of the statements, it must be now in the hundreds, or certainly over 100, the amount of statements from every organization, every professional group, and even in totally reactionary corporations like Facebook and Google, right? You have employees who are agitating to make clear that the kinds of censorship that those companies employ is unacceptable.
I wanted to move on to another question about recently there's been a lot of reports about the rise in anti-Semitism in the United States. And so that's often being conflated with pro-Palestinian solidarity. So I was wondering if some of our panelists can speak to that and how you navigate, showing support and solidarity for Palestinians while also not being framed as anti-Semitic, and how do you navigate that when those claims might be made? Lisa, go ahead.
I just want to say that Jewish Voice for Peace has put out an excellent letter. I'll put the link soon in the chat on this very matter. You know, all forms of racial hatred should be condemned. And these anti-Semitic attacks should be condemned. What really makes me pissed off is that they have arisen under Trump by white supremacists, and Trump gave permission to have these anti-Semitic attacks occur without any repercussions. So we already have this context starting 4 years ago. In Charlottesville, my grandparents' cemetery was attacked. In Philadelphia, on and on, you know, the killings in the Pittsburgh synagogue, these all happened under Trump. So what I resent is that, you know, like Bret Stephens' op-ed, you know, he acts like this history has already been forgotten and erased. And all we need to do is weaponize these attacks to say that it's the fault of people who support Palestinian liberation. One has nothing at all to do with the other. The anti-Semitic attacks in the United States that are disgusting have to do with Trump and white supremacy. And for those, and they are minor. Okay, no word has been mentioned about attacks on Palestinians, on Arab Americans, Islamophobia. Like that was nowhere in Bret Stephens' op-ed in the New York Times or anywhere else that who people want to tout this as a way not to support Palestinian liberation. The Committee for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, the Palestinian civil society groups have very clearly stated many times that anti-Semitism has no place in their movement, and that they are against all forms of racism. And they have definitely carried that out. So what upsets me is this weaponization of charges of anti-Semitism. Second, then it, let's say, diverts from what is truly anti-Semitism. And that does worry me a great deal, because then we're going to turn around and have all these white supremacist attacks, and people will still be trying to divert attention to the Palestinian movement. So for liberation. So that's my view on the anti-Semitism stuff.
Can I just add to Lisa's really eloquent statement that the strength of any anti-racist and anti-colonial movement is actually in its solidarity with other movements. And as has already been said, the Palestinian movement has deeply benefited from Black Lives Matter and from indigenous movements, and hopefully has sort of given back in solidarity with them also, as I think it has given back in solidarity with migrant communities, recognizing the similarities between the wall on the border here and the apartheid wall in Israel, both of which are supplied by the same corporation, Elbit Systems, that was recently closed down in the UK by pro-Palestinian activists. That means that if you are serious about wanting to fight anti-Semitism, you need to do so in solidarity with the other organizations that are fighting anti-racist and anti-colonial struggles elsewhere, including with Palestine. If you want to try to make an exception for anti-Semitism as a kind of privileged form of racism that you're fighting against by saying we will not in fact include in our solidarity the very organizations that in fact Jewish people should be concerned about supporting, those who are oppressed by the state of Israel, then you are in fact weakening the struggle against anti-Semitism. On the contrary, the BDS movement, as expressed by the BDS National Council in Palestine, is, as Sunaina said right at the start, deeply committed to anti-racism of all kinds. And I think that that's really important to stress. If you want to fight anti-Semitism, fight apartheid wherever you see it, and not just privileging one particular form of racism that affects you, because that's not going to get you anywhere in the end.
We have another question in the chat, which says, what do you say to allies or activists who live in fear of facing obstacles in their professional life for publicly supporting Palestine, or student leaders who disengage from the movement in fear of Canary Mission?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Yes, absolutely. So the question is, what do you say to allies or activists who live in fear of facing obstacles in their professional life for publicly supporting Palestine, or student leaders who disengage from the movement in fear of Canary Mission?
I could say a few words, which kind of, we've addressed this a little bit earlier. So I kind of want to add to what I said earlier about making sure you have collective support, making sure you're documenting the attacks, making sure you're acknowledging the uneven impact it has on Palestinians, especially those with family in Palestine. But I actually just wanted to kind of add to this that it's also important, to disentangle the terms by which you're attacked and rebut them and assert your own framework. So just as Lisa and David just said, if anti-Semitism is being weaponized or it's being trivialized in order to target supporters of racial justice, including Jewish American supporters, it's important to challenge the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So I want to kind of also just piggyback on this response to address the earlier question, which is that what I see happening as there are fewer and fewer political counter-arguments for anti-Palestinian forces to deploy because the facts on the ground are becoming clearer and clearer, and they're in plain sight for everybody. I think what's happening, there's going to be an increasing reliance on this allegation of anti-Semitism to shut down debate and to shut down the movement for justice in Palestine. This has actually been undergirded by Trump's resolution that he slipped in just before he stepped down, conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism using this IHRA definition that I mentioned in the chat. I think it's really important to have the conversation that Lisa has brought up, using resources from JVP, from IJAN, to point out that this is actually a disservice to Jewish people. It's also diverting from the strength of the Palestinian movement. But I think it's not a coincidence. Clearly, there are also people who want to tar and smear Palestinian justice activists with the charge of anti-Semitism, just as the movement is really being strengthened.
So I wanted to ask another question about just we've mentioned sort of the BDS movement within the UC system, and I think there's been a lot of this attention paid to it over the last few years. And so I was just sort of wondering what is the state of the BDS movement within the UCs? Have they actually divested from complicit companies? And I think for me personally, I think like a lot of times I'm hearing about these proposals and these resolutions being passed, but I guess I was wondering what is sort of the current state of it and how effective has that been?
Let me say first, our administrations notoriously cave to Zionist pressure over and over again. Just to give one instance, this is not a huge victory against corporations, but it was a significant step. The Student Representative Council here, the Student Senate, voted to remove Sabra hummus, which masquerades as a kind of, product coming from the Middle East and all of that, but is in fact made in Israel from the shelves of student cafes and so forth. And that process began, and then the administration intervened to overturn that resolution. And one can see that the same thing happens. I don't know how many times student bodies have voted for divestment and for supporting BDS, and administrations have come down and said, not on our life, right? But big surprise. I mean, why would we expect otherwise? Even at the height of the South Africa divestment movement, the then UC president, Gardner, refused to act. and continued to talk long after all these resolutions had been passed, and I think even long after Mandela was released from prison, by saying we have to think about the gray areas on this issue. In the case of apartheid, there are no gray issues. That's what apartheid means. It's a separation of people into completely distinct groups. So we should not be surprised if our administrations, who are who they are because they retain power and because they seek donors, would in fact try to stamp out moves towards BDS. That's why US ACPI is engaged in a campaign, trying to build a campaign to go after education abroad programs in Israel. There's a very specific reason for this. Education abroad programs in Israel are in fact in violation of anti-discrimination policies that the UC campuses all sign on to, which say that no program should be one that excludes certain members of the community on the basis of protected categories, including national origin, ethnicity, and so forth. The State Department acknowledges that people who may just have an Arab name or who are in fact of Palestinian origin may well be excluded from Israel if they try to travel there. And that fact is well known to any Palestinian who wants to go to Israel. That's you know, there's no news there. But that means that those programs are on their face discriminatory and therefore should not be part of the UC system's educational mission. So to go after that may, of course, once again get shut down. But what it enables us to do is communicate to a larger part of the faculty and the student body and the staff in our institutions that Israel systematically discriminates against our students because it systematically discriminates with 65 discriminatory laws on the books against Palestinians within Israel, and as it runs also apartheid regimes in the West Bank and a regime of occupation and blockade against Gaza. So it allows us to actually publicize these issues, to force them to debate on Senate committees and student bodies and so forth. And that's part, as I said earlier, of the important work of BDS, to get the facts out. So whatever I think corporations one goes after, policies or programs one goes after, you have to think strategically as to whether going after those particular entities will allow you to get facts out, to get facts before the public. And so that's I think the important thing here.
All right, thank you so much for all of your participation, panelists, and for sharing your knowledge with us today. I know I appreciated it, and I'm sure many of us on this call also appreciated it. I'd like to point out that there is a survey within the chat. So for everyone who has attended, if you'd like to give us some feedback, we would greatly appreciate that. And I'd just like to personally thank the, like my colleagues within the UCs who are located within the SWANA centers for organizing this event. And essentially, thank you all. So Omar, please take it away with our final statement.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank again our faculty for being here and for the colleagues across the UCs for making this happen. And wanted to give an opportunity for our faculty to share any last words before we log off. If you all have anything else you wanted to share.
I just wanted to thank you all, because I think given everything that's just been said, I want to acknowledge that you all have been courageous too, as our colleagues in student affairs organizing this. And I really want to appreciate that. I actually don't know if there's been a UC-wide teach-in on Palestine before. David and Lisa, maybe you have some institutional memory. In the 15 years, 16 years I've been at UC Davis, I don't recall ever there being an official UC-sponsored teach-in in Palestine. So big props to you all. You work really hard. You support students who face some of the most difficult challenges on campus, including our Palestinian students especially. And just also to, you know, add to what David just said, and just to respond to Omar. Omar, I think, you know, the victory is in the struggle. It's not just in getting those divestment resolutions passed. I mean, I really do think that every time students talk about this issue, every time that you all organize or sponsor or support an event in Palestine, you're enlarging political and intellectual space to talk about, you know, one of the nodes of global justice struggles in our time. And so I really just appreciate all the work that went into doing this emergency teach-in, and to everyone who attended. So thank you.
Yes, thank you all. I can only imagine the pressure you come up against in your own daily work. And it is courageous, and I just want a shout out to you also, and a shout out to all the SJPs on our various campuses who have also faced the kinds of attacks that we've been talking about, and yet have continued to organize. And in my experience, there's very little that can be done by way of transforming university campuses without student movements. Faculty can actually do very, very little off their own without that support and that solidarity for students. So since you work with the students, thank you for doing that every day. And thank you for organizing this panel. And thank you to SJP for being there and being with us.
Yeah, I just want to echo Sunaina and David's words. Thank you, thank you, thank you to everyone. That's all.
I echo all the thanks as well.
All right, thank you, everyone. Oh, go ahead.
No, yeah, I appreciate you all, and thank you to everybody who joined us today and made time and took time to be part of today's conversation. So we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow if you're available to join us for our community healing circle. So please feel free to join in and register today to be there in solidarity with our Palestinian students as well. And thank you again for everybody who joined us.